Beneath the endless Pacific sky in the year 1944, the Marshall Islands stretched across the ocean like scattered emeralds set in an infinite band of brilliant blue. These were not the towering volcanic peaks that dominated other island chains, but rather delicate rings of coral, atolls, whose narrow strips of land barely rose above the waves that had shaped them over countless centuries. For the forces of Imperial Japan, these fragile-looking formations represented something far more substantial than their physical appearance suggested. They were the first wall, the outermost barrier in a defensive network that stretched back thousands of miles toward the home islands. Japanese commanders believed, perhaps with more hope than certainty, that here among these coral rings they could finally stem the relentless western advance of American naval power that had been gathering momentum since the dark days following Pearl Harbor. For the United States Navy and Marine Corps, the Marshall Islands meant something altogether different. The bloody lessons learned during the assault on Tarawa Atoll just weeks earlier had been carved into the memories of every Marine who survived that particular hell. The cost in American lives had been staggering. The images of bodies floating in the lagoon waters haunted the dreams of commanders and privates alike. Yet Tarawa had also taught invaluable lessons about amphibious warfare, lessons that would be applied here in the Marshalls. These islands were not merely the next objective on a map studied in planning rooms across Pearl Harbor and Washington. They were the gateway, the essential stepping stone that would unlock the route to the Marianas, and from the Marianas the path led inexorably onward toward the Japanese home islands themselves. Without the Marshalls, the entire American strategy in the Central Pacific would stall, leaving forces to grind through a longer, bloodier island-by-island campaign. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the quiet Texan who commanded all Allied forces in the Pacific Ocean areas, understood these strategic realities with crystalline clarity. After reviewing intelligence reports, aerial reconnaissance photographs, and the hard-won tactical knowledge from Tarawa, he made a decision that would prove both bold and controversial. Rather than follow the cautious approach of seizing the outer ring of the Marshalls first, establishing bases on the periphery before moving inward, Nimitz approved a plan that would leap directly into the heart of the archipelago. This operation received the codename Flintlock, and its primary target was Kwajalein Atoll, the largest coral atoll in the world and the administrative center of Japanese power throughout the Marshall Islands. Kwajalein was far more than just another curved strip of sand and palm trees sitting inside a sheltered lagoon. Military planners in Tokyo had transformed it into a vital node in their defensive network and supply chain. The atoll's deep water harbor could accommodate large vessels, making it a crucial transshipment point for men and materiel heading to Japan's far-flung garrisons across the Central Pacific. An airfield capable of handling bombers had been carved from the coral and sand, allowing Japanese aircraft to patrol vast stretches of ocean and threaten any American approach. Intelligence estimates placed the garrison's strength at substantial numbers. The main island of Kwajalein itself held Japanese combat troops alongside thousands of Korean and Okinawan laborers who had been conscripted or coerced into supporting the war effort. To the north, the twin islands of Roy and Namur, connected by a narrow causeway, housed another 3,000 defenders tasked with protecting vital installations, including another airfield and substantial ammunition storage facilities. The Japanese had not been idle during their years of occupation. Reinforced concrete bunkers, some with walls several feet thick, dotted the islands like malignant growths. Naval guns of 127 millimeters, weapons capable of firing shells weighing dozens of pounds across miles of ocean, had been emplaced in hardened positions with overlapping fields of fire. Anti-tank guns of 75 millimeters waited in carefully prepared positions, their crews trained to engage the armoured vehicles they knew would inevitably come. Heavy machine guns, the brutal tools of defensive warfare, had been buried in underground shelters connected by networks of trenches and tunnels. Every defensive position had been sited with care, every field of fire calculated to create interlocking zones of death for any force attempting to storm ashore. The Japanese High Command had issued orders that left no room for interpretation or mercy. Their men were to fight to the last bullet, to sell their lives as dearly as possible, to make the Americans pay in blood for every yard of coral sand. This was to be a battle without quarter, a confrontation where surrender was unthinkable and death preferable to the shame of capture. But the American forces preparing to assault Kwajalein were not the same green troops who had waded into the murderous fire at Tarawa. The Pacific Command structure had absorbed those terrible lessons and integrated them into every aspect of planning and preparation. The divisions selected for the assault, both Marine and Army units, had spent months training under the warm Hawaiian sun. Every day brought new drills, new exercises, new refinements to tactics and techniques. Marines practiced maneuvering the tracked landing vehicles known as Amtraks or LVTS through heavy surf, learning to read the waves and time their approach to minimize the vulnerable period between leaving the transport ships and reaching the beach. Engineers worked to mount bulldozer blades on some of the LVTS, creating armoured vehicles capable of pushing through obstacles that had stymied previous assaults. The coordination between naval gunfire support ships and the ground forces received particular attention, with forward observers training extensively to call in fire missions and adjust salvos as troops moved inland. Innovation appeared everywhere in the preparations. For the first time in the Pacific War, some LVTS would be armed with 37mm guns, transforming them from simple personnel carriers into floating fire support platforms capable of engaging enemy positions directly from the water. On Hawaiian beaches that approximated the coral reefs and tidal conditions of the Marshalls, engineers constructed full-scale mock-ups of Japanese bunker designs based on intelligence photographs and reports from Tarawa. Day after day, night after night, assault teams practiced their approaches, learning to identify firing ports, recognize the dead spaces where attacking troops might find brief shelter, and coordinate the use of flamethrowers, satchel charges, and small arms to systematically reduce each strong point. Medical personnel received their own specialized training, learning to administer emergency care aboard the pitching, crowded LVTS during the run to shore. Offshore, white-hulled hospital ships prepared to receive what everyone knew would be substantial numbers of wounded, their operating rooms stocked with plasma, their surgeons mentally preparing for the grim work ahead. Every measure imaginable was taken to ensure that Kwajalein would not become another Tarawa, would not see American boys drowning in the surf or dying in windrows on beaches swept by murderous fire before they could even reach cover. The planning was meticulous, almost obsessive. Staff officers worked through countless variations and contingencies, wargaming scenarios and seeking solutions to every potential problem. Nothing could be left to chance, nothing overlooked. The price of failure was measured in American lives, and no commander wanted to write letters home explaining why their men had died due to inadequate preparation. Operation Flintlock officially commenced during the final days of November 1943, though the actual invasion remained months away. American airstrikes began falling on targets throughout the Marshall Islands, the bombers flying from newly established bases in the Gilbert Islands that had been seized during the Tarawa campaign. From the 4th of December onward, barely a day passed without the thunder of aircraft engines overhead and the crump of exploding bombs below. For weeks that stretched into months, B-24 Liberator heavy bombers made the long flights across the Pacific to deliver their deadly cargoes. American warships, operating with increasing boldness as Japanese naval and air power in the region withered, closed to within shelling range and added the crash of naval gunfire to the aerial bombardment. Japanese airfields were cratered and recratered, their runways torn into useless lunar landscapes. Fortifications that had taken months to construct were systematically dismantled by high-explosive shells. Defensive positions were buried under avalanches of coral and shattered concrete. This was not merely a preliminary bombardment, not just the standard softening up that preceded every amphibious assault. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to destroy Japanese air power in the region, to prevent any interference with the invasion fleet, and to methodically dismantle the beach defences before American troops would have to face them. The assault itself would be a joint operation on a scale rarely seen in the Pacific theatre. The United States Army's 7th Infantry Division, hardened veterans who had fought in the Aleutian Islands campaign, received the assignment to capture the southern island of Kwajalein itself, the largest and most developed of the Atoll's islands. The 4th Marine Division, a newly activated formation filled with young men eager to prove themselves after missing Tarawa, would strike northward against the twin islands of Roy and Nama. Before either main assault could proceed, however, advance elements needed to secure the approaches to the lagoon. Small teams received orders to seize the tiny islets dotting the atoll's reef, establishing artillery positions that could provide direct fire support during the main landings. These preliminary operations would also secure safe passages through which the invasion fleet could steam into the sheltered waters of the lagoon itself, bringing the transport ships and landing craft close to their objectives. The sky was still dark on the morning of January 31st, 1944, when the operation began in earnest. Around 3:30 in the morning, with perhaps the faintest hint of grey touching the eastern horizon, Marine reconnaissance units launched their assault on the small islets scattered along the northwestern portion of the atoll. These were tiny scraps of land, most no more than a few hundred yards long, bearing designations on military maps like Jacob, Ivan, Albert, and Abraham. The Marines came ashore in near silence, their rubber boats barely disturbing the calm lagoon waters. Whatever Japanese guards remained on these islets, dazed by weeks of bombardment and perhaps not expecting an attack in the pre-dawn darkness, offered minimal resistance. Within hours, all 4 islets were in American hands, and engineers were already surveying positions for the artillery batteries that would support the main assault. Simultaneously, Army troops from the 7th Infantry Division struck at Carter and Cecil Islands on the western side of the atoll. These slightly larger islets controlled the approaches to the main entrance into Kwajalein lagoon. Their capture was essential to allow the invasion fleet safe passage. The soldiers moved quickly and efficiently, overwhelming the small Japanese detachments with a combination of surprise and overwhelming firepower. By the time the sun rose fully above the eastern horizon, transforming the Pacific from grey to brilliant blue, all of the preliminary objectives were secured. Artillery crews immediately began hauling their guns ashore and preparing firing positions in the coral sand. At precisely 6 o'clock that morning, with the preliminary islets secure and artillery batteries ready, the true bombardment of Kwajalein began. The sound was unlike anything most of the men in the invasion fleet had experienced before. United States Navy warships, battleships whose main batteries could hurl shells weighing as much as a small automobile, cruisers with rapid-firing secondary armaments, destroyers whose guns might be smaller but whose accuracy was deadly, all opened fire in a carefully coordinated barrage. Salvo after salvo crashed down on the Japanese defensive positions like hammers wielded by angry gods. The entire atoll seemed to shake beneath the weight of explosives. Palm trees, those graceful symbols of tropical paradise, were shredded into splinters or blown completely away. Concrete bunkers that had seemed impregnable cracked and collapsed. Trenches filled with debris. Ammunition storage points erupted in spectacular secondary explosions that sent columns of fire and smoke towering thousands of feet into the air. Throughout the entire day of January 31st and continuing into the morning hours of February 1st, the bombardment never slackened. The men of Task Force 53, the naval formation assigned to support the Kwajalein assault, brought their ships to within just a few thousand meters of shore, close enough that observers could see individual palm trees through their binoculars before those trees vanished in clouds of smoke and flying debris. At such close range, the naval gunfire became almost surgical in its precision. Forward observers, specially trained officers who had studied aerial photographs and intelligence reports until they knew every significant Japanese position, called in fire missions against specific targets. A bunker here, a gun emplacement there, a suspected command post, a communications center. The naval guns serviced each target methodically, professionally, without haste, but without pause. Overhead, wave after wave of B-24 bombers droned in from their bases in the Gilbert Islands. The Liberators, ungainly-looking aircraft that nonetheless carried devastating bomb loads, concentrated particularly on Roy and Namur to the north. The airfield on Roy, a vital installation that had allowed Japanese aircraft to patrol vast stretches of ocean, received special attention. Bombs cratered the runway until it resembled a moonscape. The revetments where aircraft had sheltered were systematically destroyed. On Namur, the bombers targeted the substantial ammunition and fuel storage facilities that intelligence had identified. Some of these dumps exploded with such violence that the shock waves could be felt miles away, rattling the bulkheads of ships in the lagoon and causing sailors to instinctively duck even though they were far from any danger. The effect of this sustained bombardment was catastrophic for the Japanese defenders. Anti-aircraft guns that tried to engage the bombers were quickly silenced by naval gunfire. Machine gun positions simply ceased to exist, buried under tons of coral and shattered concrete. Defensive positions that had taken months to prepare were obliterated in hours. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, the crusty Marine commander known throughout the Corps by his nickname Howlin' Mad Smith, later reflected on the effectiveness of the naval gunfire with almost poetic appreciation. He admitted, with the candour of a man who had seen too much combat to indulge in false modesty or inter-service rivalry, that he had never loved the United States Navy quite so much as he did during those hours of bombardment. It was their guns, their accurate and overwhelming firepower, that had smashed the beach defences and would save countless marine lives in the hours to come. Aboard the transport ships anchored in the lagoon, American soldiers and Marines felt the physical impact of each salvo. The concussion from the big naval guns rattled through the ships' hulls, making cups dance on tables and causing loose equipment to shift and clatter. Men lined the rails when they were allowed topside, watching with a mixture of awe and grim satisfaction as the islands they would soon assault vanished beneath curtains of smoke and geysers of debris. Some of the younger troops, boys barely out of high school who had never seen combat, whispered among themselves with a naive confidence born of inexperience. After such a bombardment, they reasoned, how could anyone possibly still be alive on those islands? The veterans, men who had seen Guadalcanal or Tarawa or the savage fighting in New Guinea, kept their thoughts to themselves. They knew that however devastating the bombardment appeared, some of the enemy would survive. Some bunkers would remain intact. Some machine guns would still be functional. Some Japanese soldiers would still be waiting with rifles and grenades when the Americans came ashore. It was the nature of war, the terrible arithmetic of combat that no amount of bombardment could entirely overcome. The sensory experience aboard the ships was overwhelming. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of cordite and burning oil mixing with the salt tang of the sea. The thunder of the guns was not merely heard but felt, a continuous drumbeat that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the chest and bones. Periodically, the wind would shift and carry smoke from the burning islands across the anchorage, causing men to cough and their eyes to water. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly, turning the metal decks hot enough to burn exposed skin, while below decks the troop compartments were stifling, airless spaces where hundreds of men waited in their own sweat and anxiety. On the islands receiving this terrible punishment, the experience was apocalyptic. On Roy and Namur, Japanese artillery crews who had drilled countless times in the efficient operation of their 127mm naval guns found themselves helpless. Shortly after 8 o'clock on the morning of February 1st, crews attempted desperately to return fire, to engage the American warships that were systematically destroying their positions. But the bombardment had severed all communication lines with headquarters. Field telephone cables had been cut by shell bursts. Radio antennas had been blown away. Runners attempting to carry messages between positions were caught in the open and simply vanished in explosions or fell to shrapnel that seemed to fill the air like lethal rain. Many of the reinforced bunkers, structures that had seemed proof against anything short of a direct hit by the heaviest shells, collapsed as near misses weakened their foundations, and direct hits simply overwhelmed their structural integrity. Inside these collapsing shelters, young Japanese soldiers found themselves buried alive, tons of concrete and coral sand pressing down in absolute darkness. Officers clawed at the rubble with bleeding hands, hearing the muffled cries of trapped men but unable to reach them. They found blood seeping between chunks of shattered concrete, heard voices growing weaker as trapped men suffocated in the airless darkness, felt the faint vibrations of dying breaths through the debris. Then silence. The surviving defenders understood with terrible clarity that they were completely isolated, cut off from any possibility of support or reinforcement. No Japanese aircraft would come to attack the American ships. The once formidable air groups based in the Marshalls had been systematically destroyed during the weeks of preliminary bombardment. No Japanese warships would appear on the horizon. The combined fleet had withdrawn westward after devastating losses at Midway and in the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign. The defenders had only what supplies and ammunition remained in their bunkers and shelters, perhaps enough for a few days of intense combat if rationed carefully, but certainly not enough for a prolonged defence. Yet surrender was unthinkable, not merely because their orders forbade it, but because the entire culture and training of the Imperial Japanese Army had instilled in them the concept of gyokusai, the beautiful death of the shattered jewel. It was better, more honourable, to die fighting than to live with the unbearable shame of captivity. And so, in bunkers and shelters across Kwajalein, Roy and Namur, young Japanese soldiers used knives or pieces of charcoal to scratch final messages on concrete walls. They wrote to parents they would never see again, to wives and sweethearts waiting in distant Japan who would receive only the briefest official notification of death in battle. They wrote apologies for failing to return home, expressions of hope that their sacrifice would mean something, protestations of loyalty to the Emperor and to Japan. Then they checked their rifles one final time, ensured their bayonets were properly fixed, and settled in to wait for the Americans they knew were coming. Meanwhile, aboard the American ships, many Marines were genuinely stunned by the sheer destructive power of their own naval gunfire. These young men, many of whom had grown up in small towns across America where the loudest sound might be a passing freight train or a summer thunderstorm, now witnessed firepower on a scale that defied comprehension. Each salvo from a battleship's main battery shook the entire vessel despite its thousands of tons of displacement. The muzzle blast from the big guns created visible shock waves in the air, rippling outward like heat shimmer on a desert highway. From their vantage points on the rails or in smaller craft closer to shore, they watched as black smoke and debris leaped skyward with each impact, debris that included chunks of concrete, shattered palm trunks, and things they tried not to think about too carefully. Some whispered their doubts and hopes to buddies standing nearby, wondering aloud whether anything could possibly survive such overwhelming violence. The smell was omnipresent, inescapable, an acrid blend of burning fuel oil, cordite propellant, and the peculiar sharp tang of shattered coral mixed with the ever-present salt of the sea. The thunder of the guns rolled across the lagoon like an unending storm, a man-made tempest that showed no sign of abating. In the southern sector of the atoll, the United States Army's 7th Infantry Division, commanded by the capable and thorough Major General Charles Corlett, prepared to execute its portion of the assault. The division's mission was the capture of Kwajalein Island itself, the largest landmass in the atoll and the administrative and logistical centre of Japanese operations throughout the Marshalls. Corlett divided his force into 2 wings for a coordinated attack from both flanks. The 184th Infantry Regiment would advance along the right or northern sector of the island, while the 32nd Infantry Regiment would push up the left or southern coast. From their positions on Carter and Cecil Islands, recently captured by the advance units, American artillery batteries had been emplaced and ranged on their targets. These guns, though smaller than the naval rifles pounding the island from offshore, could deliver rapid, sustained fire in support of the infantry advance. Meanwhile, the battleships and cruisers of the support force continued to pour shells into the central and eastern portions of Kwajalein Island, working over positions that the ground troops would not reach for hours or even days. At 9:30 on the morning of February 1st, the naval bombardment began a carefully planned shift. Rather than continue plastering the landing beaches, the naval gunfire lifted and moved inland, striking at positions further from shore to prevent Japanese reinforcements from moving forward to contest the landing. This was the signal for the assault to commence. Amphibious tractors, the LVTS that had been loaded with soldiers during the pre-dawn hours and had been circling in the lagoon waiting for H-hour, now turned their blunt noses toward the beaches and began their final approach. The tracked vehicles crawled through the shallow lagoon waters with a distinctive churning motion, throwing up spray that caught the morning sunlight in brief rainbows. Inside each LVT, soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder in cramped discomfort, laden with equipment and ammunition, rifles held between their knees, trying to keep their balance as the vehicles pitched and rolled through the choppy water. Some prayed silently, lips moving in familiar litanies learned in childhood. Others stared at nothing, faces blank, minds focused on staying calm and remembering their training. A few joked nervously, trying to dispel tension with gallows humour that fell flat in the roar of engines and the crash of distant explosions. The beaches they approached had been transformed into a landscape from another world. The graceful palms that had once lined the shore were gone, reduced to splintered stumps or simply erased entirely. The white coral sand was torn and cratered, littered with debris and the twisted wreckage of defensive positions. Smoke still drifted across the scene, and here and there small fires burned where fuel or ammunition had been ignited. As the LVTS ground up onto the beach and their ramps dropped, soldiers splashed out into what many had feared would be a storm of fire. Instead, they met only scattered resistance. Here a sniper fired a few shots before being located and eliminated. There, a machine gun crew that had somehow survived the bombardment in an underground shelter tried to resist but was quickly overwhelmed. Most of the beach defences, the bunkers and gun emplacements and trench systems that had been laboriously constructed over months of effort, had simply been crushed during the hours of bombardment. Intelligence estimates later suggested that between 50 and 75% of the Japanese defenders on Kwajalein Island had been killed before the first American soldier set foot ashore, victims of the most intense preliminary bombardment in the Pacific War to that date. The initial waves moved quickly across the beaches and pushed inland. Combat engineers used their explosives and bulldozer blades to fill in anti-tank ditches, creating passages for the vehicles that were already coming ashore behind the infantry. M4 Sherman medium tanks, their engines roaring and tracks clanking, rolled off larger landing craft and moved to support the advancing troops. The presence of the tanks provided an enormous boost to infantry morale and tactical capability. When a surviving Japanese bunker was identified, often by the crack of rifle fire or the distinctive chatter of a Nambu machine gun, a Sherman would maneuver into position and methodically destroy it with 75mm high explosive shells fired at point-blank range. The American advance spread inland like a rising tide, meeting pockets of resistance that were fierce but brief, isolated and unable to coordinate any effective defense. By noon on that first day, soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division had pushed completely across the narrow waist of Kwajalein Island and reached the airfield that had been one of the primary objectives. The American flag was raised over what had been, just hours earlier, a vital Japanese installation. Photographers captured the moment for posterity, the stars and stripes snapping in the breeze while behind the flag raisers the landscape lay devastated and smoking. Yet the battle for Kwajalein Island was far from over. While the landing and initial advance had gone better than anyone had dared hope, there remained 3.5 more days of fighting before the island could be declared secure. The combat that followed fell into a grim pattern that would become all too familiar in the island campaigns ahead. During the daylight hours, American forces advanced methodically, using overwhelming firepower to reduce each pocket of resistance. Flamethrowers, terrifying weapons that projected streams of burning fuel, proved devastatingly effective against bunkers and underground shelters. Grenades were used constantly, fragmenting in confined spaces to deadly effect. White phosphorus rounds, which burst into clouds of burning particles that could not be extinguished with water, were employed to force defenders out of positions, or to ensure that cleared bunkers stayed cleared. The island's network of underground shelters proved to be both a defensive strength and a tactical nightmare. These subterranean positions allowed Japanese soldiers to survive bombardments that would have killed anyone above ground, but they also isolated the defenders, preventing coordination and allowing American forces to methodically eliminate each position in turn. At night, the character of the fighting changed. Surviving Japanese soldiers, knowing their situation was hopeless, launched desperate counterattacks intended not to recapture lost ground, but simply to kill as many Americans as possible before they themselves were killed. These nocturnal assaults came screaming out of the darkness, small groups of men charging with bayonets fixed and grenades in hand, seeking to break through American lines, or at least to die in combat rather than wait passively for death. American defensive positions, carefully prepared during the day with interlocking fields of fire, cut these attacks to pieces. Artillery laid down pre-registered defensive fires. Machine guns swept the darkness with tracer rounds that looked like strings of deadly pearls. Trip flares burst into brilliant white light, freezing the attackers in stark illumination and making them easy targets. By dawn, the ground in front of American positions would be littered with bodies, grim evidence of suicidal courage that achieved nothing except death. By the morning of February 4th, the end was clearly approaching. The 184th Infantry Regiment had driven the last organised resistance into the eastern tip of the island, compressing the survivors into an ever-shrinking perimeter. The 32nd Infantry Regiment had secured the western end, including the warehouses and barracks that would soon be converted to American use. At 10:30 that morning, after a final exchange of fire that lasted only minutes, the last pockets of resistance were eliminated. Kwajalein Island was declared secure. The casualty figures, when compiled, revealed both the effectiveness of the preliminary bombardment and the continuing dangers of ground combat. 177 American soldiers had been killed and approximately 1,000 wounded over the course of 4 days of fighting. On the Japanese side, the numbers were catastrophic. Nearly 5,000 Japanese troops and Korean labourers had been killed, virtually the entire garrison wiped out. Only a few dozen prisoners were taken alive, most of them wounded men found unconscious in bunkers or Korean labourers who had never wanted to be there in the first place. While the battle for Kwajalein Island raged in the south, forces of the 4th Marine Division faced a more complicated situation in the north at Roy and Namur. These twin islands, connected by a narrow causeway, presented distinct tactical challenges. Roy, the western island, was relatively flat and open, its terrain dominated by the large airfield that was the primary military installation. Namur, to the east, was more heavily vegetated with dense groves of palm trees and more extensively fortified with bunkers and underground positions. The assault plan called for simultaneous landings on both islands at 10 o'clock on the morning of February 1st, with the 23rd Marines assigned to Roy and the 24th Marines tasked with securing Namur. Almost immediately, the plan began to encounter difficulties. The shortage of amphibious tractors, a problem that had plagued Pacific operations since Guadalcanal, forced compromises and adjustments. The landing force had perhaps 20 of the armoured LVTAS equipped with 37mm guns, formidable fire support platforms that could suppress beach defences during the approach. They had several dozen of the standard LVT-2 troop carriers, but there were not enough vehicles to put all assault units ashore simultaneously with proper support. Units became mixed during the assembly offshore, scattered among various landing craft and tractors in a confusion that no amount of pre-planning seemed able to entirely prevent. The result was that H-hour, the designated moment for the assault to begin, had to be delayed. 10 o'clock came and went, with Marines still sorting themselves into their proper units and vehicles. The postponement was frustrating but unavoidable. The delay actually proved beneficial in one respect. While the infantry waited impatiently in their bobbing landing craft, artillery batteries on the small islets that had been captured the previous day continued to pound Roy and Namur with sustained fire. Overhead, carrier aircraft from the fast carriers offshore maintained constant patrol, ready to strafe or bomb any target of opportunity, and ensuring that the Japanese could make no effective response to the approaching assault. The bombardment continued without pause, adding to the devastation already inflicted during the preceding days. At 11:33 in the morning, finally, the first wave of LVTS carrying men of the 23rd Marines surged through the waves toward Roy's beaches. Just ahead of them, specialized landing craft equipped with racks of rockets launched a final intensive barrage that blanketed the shoreline with explosions. The armoured LVTAS, their 37mm guns firing steadily, added to the din, pumping rounds into shattered palm groves and the ruins of defensive positions. As the smoke and dust began to clear, revealing a landscape that looked like some artist's nightmare vision of hell, the ramps dropped and Marines splashed ashore. The first obstacle they encountered was an anti-tank ditch, an excavation about 3 meters wide that had been dug across the likely landing beaches. But this was exactly the kind of obstacle that training in Hawaii had prepared them for. Engineers quickly placed demolition charges or used armoured bulldozers to create crossing points. Within minutes, the first infantry units were across and spreading inland. They encountered bomb craters filled with seawater, obstacles in their path, but also offering occasional cover. The advance moved quickly, much more quickly than the most optimistic planners had anticipated. Within 20 minutes of landing, the lead elements reached their first objective, a line designated on maps as O, one that lay only a few hundred meters inland. The few remaining Japanese positions that tried to resist were methodically eliminated by Sherman tanks, whose 75mm guns reduced bunkers to rubble with just a few well-aimed shots. Captain James Scales, commanding one of the assault companies, had mentally prepared himself and his Marines for the savage close combat that doctrine and training predicted. Instead, they found themselves advancing against only scattered resistance, isolated snipers who were quickly located and neutralized. The combination of the sustained bombardment and the shock effect of the landing had broken whatever organized defense might have existed. By late afternoon, as the tropical sun began its quick descent toward the western horizon, the cruiser Santa Fe moved close inshore and began shelling the central area of Roy known as the Nut Circle, a defensive position complex that aerial photos had shown to be heavily fortified. The naval gunfire reduced these positions to smoking craters, allowing infantry to advance and capture both the airfield and the warehouse complex without significant opposition. During this advance across Roy, an act of extraordinary heroism occurred that would later be recognized with the Medal of Honor, America's highest decoration for valor. Private First Class Richard Anderson, a young Marine from a small town in the Midwest, was advancing with his squad when a Japanese grenade landed among them. Without hesitation, without any apparent thought for his own safety, Anderson threw himself on the grenade, using his own body to smother the explosion. The blast killed him instantly, but his squadmates survived, saved by his sacrifice. They would carry the memory of his action for the rest of their lives, bearing witness to the kind of selfless courage that war sometimes calls forth from ordinary young men in extraordinary moments. By 6 o'clock that evening, just 7 hours after the first Marines had come ashore, Roy was declared secure. The speed of the victory surprised even the assault commanders. The sustained bombardment had quite simply obliterated most of the island's defences and killed or stunned most of its defenders. The few survivors had been unable to mount any coherent resistance. It was perhaps the clearest vindication of the new tactics and the emphasis on overwhelming preparatory fires. Namur, however, told a very different story. From the moment the 24th Marines crossed the anti-tank ditch and pushed into the shattered palm forests that covered much of the island, they found themselves drawn into exactly the kind of savage, close-quarters combat that Roy had somehow avoided. The landscape itself seemed designed for defense. Fallen palm trunks created a maze of obstacles. Bomb craters provided ready-made fighting positions. Networks of trenches and underground bunkers, many of which had survived the bombardment, allowed the defenders to appear suddenly, fire, and then vanish back into the tunnels before they could be effectively engaged. Units lost contact with each other in the confusion of smoke and vegetation. Japanese fire seemed to come from every direction, making it difficult to identify actual enemy positions versus merely suspected ones. Every few yards of advance cost American blood. In this environment of chaos and close combat, Captain John W. Power demonstrated the kind of leadership that Marines are taught to emulate, but which few can actually achieve under fire. Leading from the front, a practice that Marine officers pride themselves on, even though it greatly increases their casualty rates, Captain Power personally led a charge against a Japanese machine gun position that was holding up his company's advance. He and his men got close enough to hurl grenades into the firing aperture, silencing the weapon in a blast that killed its crew. But there was no time to rest or consolidate. Another concrete bunker, its walls scarred but intact, loomed ahead. Power rallied his men and pressed the attack, personally destroying this second position. Throughout these actions, he constantly exposed himself to enemy fire, drawing it toward himself and away from his Marines. Eventually, inevitably, he was hit. The wounds were mortal. As he lay dying in the coral sand, his men gathered around him, some weeping openly despite the bullets still cracking overhead. Captain Power's sacrifice would later be recognized with the Medal of Honor, posthumously awarded for heroism that exemplified the Corps' highest traditions. On Namur, every yard truly was bought at a terrible price. Combat engineers moved forward with heavy satchel charges, trying to clear lanes through the obstacles, but barbed wire and fallen palms seemed to trip every advancing Marine. Japanese machine guns, the 7.7mm weapons that were the Imperial Army's standard infantry support weapons, fired through the palm trunks, the rounds splintering wood and ricocheting unpredictably. Marines were forced to crawl on their bellies, dragging themselves forward inches at a time, trying to get close enough to suspected bunker positions to plant explosives in the ventilation shafts or firing ports. The technique, when it worked, was horrifyingly effective. A satchel charge would be shoved into an opening and the fuse lit. The Marines would scramble backward as fast as they could, hugging the ground. The explosion would come, muffled but powerful, followed often by a gout of flame as ammunition or fuel inside the bunker ignited. Sometimes men could be heard screaming inside. Sometimes there was only silence. The physical conditions were almost unbearable. Sweat poured from every man, stinging eyes and soaking through clothing already filthy with coral dust and powder residue. The tropical heat was oppressive, made worse by the heavy equipment every Marine carried, steel helmets and ammunition and grenades and packs full of rations and extra rounds. Men wiped frantically at their eyes, trying to clear their vision enough to see potential threats. For many of these young Marines, boys really, this was their first experience of actual combat. All the training in Hawaii had been rigorous and realistic, but nothing could truly prepare a man for the moment when other human beings were actively trying to kill him. Some Marines, in those first terrifying minutes, fired their weapons with their eyes tightly shut, unable to bear the sight of what they might be shooting at. They only dared to open their eyes again after the shooting had stopped, after the silence indicated either that the immediate threat had been eliminated or that they themselves were somehow still miraculously alive. On the afternoon of February 1st, disaster struck Namur in a form that no one had anticipated. A team of American combat engineers was systematically working their way along a lane that maps and aerial photos designated as Nut Lane, demolishing each structure they encountered to ensure no hidden defenders remained. They approached what appeared to be a warehouse or storage building, its walls damaged but still standing. Standard procedure was applied: set charges, light fuses, take cover, detonate. What no one realized, what no intelligence report had revealed, was that this particular warehouse concealed substantial stores of Japanese torpedo warheads. The resulting explosion was not merely large, it was cataclysmic. The blast created a fireball that rose hundreds of feet into the air, a column of flame and smoke visible from ships miles away in the lagoon. The shock wave radiated outward with devastating power, knocking Marines off their feet across a wide radius, collapsing nearby bunkers, creating instant casualties among men who had thought themselves safely away from the immediate fighting. When rescue parties could finally approach the epicenter of the blast, they found a crater and, scattered around it, the broken bodies of 20 Marines killed instantly and over 100 wounded with injuries ranging from ruptured eardrums to severe burns and traumatic amputations. The Namur explosion brought the entire assault to a sudden, shocked halt. For several crucial hours, the attack stalled as leaders dealt with the immediate crisis. Medical corpsmen, Navy personnel whose job was to provide battlefield care to Marines, rushed forward into areas still under sporadic fire to reach the wounded. Evacuation teams organized makeshift litter carriers to get casualties back to the beach and onto boats that would take them to the hospital ships. Officers scrambled to reorganize their units, to account for missing men, to restore some semblance of order amid scenes of utter devastation. Debris continued to rain down from the sky for minutes after the initial blast, chunks of concrete and twisted metal and worse things that no one wanted to examine too closely. The cries of wounded men filled the air, desperate calls for corpsmen, for medics, for anyone who could help ease the pain. During the night of February 1st to 2nd, the surviving Japanese defenders on Namur launched a series of infiltration attempts and small-scale banzai charges against the American positions. In the tropical darkness, shapes could barely be distinguished beyond a few feet. Japanese soldiers, some carrying bayonets fixed to their rifles, others armed only with grenades or even sharpened bamboo stakes, crept forward trying to reach the American foxholes and fighting positions. The night erupted sporadically into firefights, brief savage exchanges of shots and screams, and the flash of exploding grenades. In one foxhole, several Marines looked down in horror as a Japanese grenade, the distinctive potato masher design, rolled among them. There was perhaps a second to react before the explosion would shred them all. Private Richard Sorensen, a name that would be added to the honored roll of Medal of Honor recipients, made an instantaneous decision. He threw his body onto the grenade, wrapping himself around it as tightly as he could. The blast killed him instantly, but saved the 5 other Marines in that foxhole, men who would survive the war and carry the story of Sorensen's sacrifice for the rest of their lives. At dawn on February 2nd, the Japanese launched their largest coordinated attack, a proper banzai charge of the type that had become almost a signature of Japanese defensive tactics throughout the Pacific. Screaming battle cries that echoed across the shattered landscape, wielding rifles with fixed bayonets, swords, and even improvised weapons, hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged directly into the American lines. They ran toward barbed wire obstacles that they must have known they could never cross, toward machine gun positions whose fields of fire they could not possibly survive. The Marines and their supporting weapons cut them down in windrows. Machine guns fired until their barrels glowed red-hot. Artillerymen on offshore islets poured shells into the attackers. The path the Japanese had taken, which would quickly be nicknamed Banzai Trail by American forces, became choked with bodies, a testament to desperate courage that achieved nothing except death. The attack was suicide, pure and simple, but it was suicide motivated by a warrior code that valued death in battle above all else, that saw surrender as dishonor worse than any death. In those tense hours, the Navy corpsmen attached to the Marine battalions worked with a dedication that bordered on the superhuman. These medical personnel, many of them conscientious objectors or religious individuals who would not carry weapons, moved constantly through the combat zone. They bound wounds while bullets still cracked overhead. They administered morphine with hands that shook from exhaustion but remained steady enough to find veins. They listened to the moans and cries of wounded men, trying to prioritize who needed evacuation most urgently, who could wait, who was beyond help. Many of the wounded called out desperately for the corpsman, Doc being the universal nickname for these medical angels. Shrapnel wounds were particularly ghastly, jagged metal fragments that drove deep into flesh and bone, creating injuries that no amount of training could fully prepare one to treat. Stretcher teams, usually composed of 4 men, crawled forward under fire to retrieve casualties, often having to navigate through areas still contested by snipers and hidden defenders. They moved low, keeping below the line of sight of enemy positions, dragging their wounded comrades back to improvised aid stations set up in the relative shelter of palm groves or bomb craters. Young Marines learned quickly that absolute silence could mean the difference between life and death. Japanese patrols moved through the darkness, trying to locate American positions. A cough, a whisper, even the click of equipment could draw a grenade or a burst of automatic fire. Men lay in their foxholes barely breathing, knowing that enemy soldiers might be passing within feet of them. The air was thick with more than just humidity and heat. The smell of blood and antiseptic from the aid stations mixed with the stench of death and the peculiar acrid odour of high explosives. Sudden tropical rainstorms, brief but intense, plastered clothes to skin and turned foxholes into muddy pools, adding physical misery to the constant psychological strain. On the morning of February 2nd, Marine commanders ordered a final coordinated assault to crush the last organised resistance on Namur. The attack would come from 2 directions, a classic pincer movement designed to squeeze the remaining defenders into an ever smaller area until they could be eliminated. One prong would advance from the southwest, the other from the southeast. Both would have full support from Sherman tanks and armoured half-tracks, mobile platforms mounting heavy machine guns that could suppress enemy fire and allow infantry to advance. Combat engineers went ahead of the main assault, clearing mines and barbed wire, using Bangalore torpedoes to blast gaps in obstacles, creating lanes through which the infantry could advance relatively safely. Among the leaders of this final assault was Colonel Samuel Diaz, an experienced officer who had served with the Marines for more than a decade. Diaz personally led one of the spearhead units, moving at the front of his men in the finest tradition of Marine leadership. As they approached the final trench line, a shell burst nearby, shrapnel scything through the air. Colonel Diaz fell, mortally wounded. His men gathered around their dying commander, and with his last breaths, Diaz urged them forward, insisted they complete the mission, told them not to stop for him. His death, like so many others, would later be recognized with the Medal of Honor, an honor he would never know he received. By midday on February 2nd, the volume of gunfire across Namur began to diminish noticeably. One by one, the Japanese defensive positions fell silent. Some defenders died, still firing their weapons. Others, when ammunition ran out or their positions became untenable, committed suicide rather than surrender. In underground bunkers and shelters, some simply waited for the end, perhaps hoping for a miracle that would never come. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, as the tropical sun beat down on a landscape of devastation, an American flag was raised over the last Japanese strongpoint on Namur. The sound of gunfire, which had been almost continuous for 36 hours, finally ceased. Marines, exhausted beyond the power of words to describe, simply sat down where they were and stared at nothing, trying to process what they had experienced. The final casualty figures for Roy Namur told a story of overwhelming American firepower versus doomed Japanese determination. Of more than 3,500 Japanese soldiers and Korean labourers who had been stationed on the Twin Islands, only about 130 survived to be captured or surrender. The rest were killed. The Marines suffered 190 dead and 537 wounded. These numbers, while tragic for every individual and family involved, represented a dramatic improvement over the casualties at Tarawa, vindication of the new tactics and the emphasis on overwhelming preparatory bombardment. As the smoke cleared and the guns finally fell silent across the entire Kwajalein atoll, the landscape revealed was one of almost complete devastation. Palm trees that had swayed in tropical breezes just days before were now splintered stumps or simply gone. Reinforced concrete bunkers that had seemed impregnable were reduced to rubble. The beaches were littered with the wreckage of war, shell casings and spent cartridges, discarded equipment and things no one wanted to look at too closely. The entire atoll was in American hands. Operation Flintlock had succeeded beyond even the optimistic projections of its planners. The transformation of Kwajalein began almost immediately. While burial details performed their grim work and medical teams continued to treat the wounded, engineers were already surveying sites for new construction. The Japanese airfields on Kwajalein and Roy Namur were quickly repaired and expanded. Within days, literally just days after the last shots were fired, American B-25 Mitchell medium bombers and fighter aircraft were flying missions from these newly captured runways. Their targets included Eniwetok Atoll to the west, still in Japanese hands, Saipan in the Marianas, and most significantly the great Japanese naval base at Truk in the Caroline Islands. The capture of Kwajalein had effectively cut the supply routes from Japan's fortress at Truk to the outer island garrisons, beginning the isolation that would eventually force Japan's navy to abandon what had been its most important forward base. The strategic implications of the victory at Kwajalein rippled outward through American planning for the entire Pacific War. The operation had proven that the island-hopping strategy could work, that it was possible to bypass strongly held positions and strike directly at key objectives deep in the Japanese defensive perimeter. The success shortened the timetable for the assault on the Mariana Islands by an estimated 6 months, a compression of the operational schedule that would have profound effects on the entire course of the war. Most importantly, Kwajalein demonstrated that American naval gunfire, when applied with sufficient intensity and duration, could simply overwhelm Japanese beach defences. This lesson, however, came with an important caveat that would become apparent in later campaigns. The Japanese High Command studied their defeat at Kwajalein carefully and drew conclusions that would shape their defensive strategy for the remainder of the war. If beach defences could be destroyed by naval bombardment, then the solution was obvious. Do not try to defend the beaches. Instead, build defences in depth, create elaborate cave systems and underground fortifications inland, force the Americans to come ashore relatively unopposed, and then contest every yard of advance through the interior. This new defensive doctrine would be applied with terrible effectiveness at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, and most horrifically at Okinawa, where American casualties would reach levels that dwarfed anything seen at Kwajalein. On the night of February 4, 1944, as the last gunfire finally ceased and silence returned to the Kwajalein lagoon for the first time in weeks, flares lit up the night sky over the anchorage. The flares were for practical purposes, helping landing craft navigate safely in the darkness, but they created an almost surreal scene, casting everything in stark blacks and whites, creating shadows that danced and jumped. On the beaches, American soldiers and Marines used these hours to perform one final duty for their fallen comrades. They dug graves in the coral sand, wrapped bodies in ponchos or shelter halves, and conducted brief services by the light of kerosene lanterns. Some men offered prayers they remembered from childhood. Others simply stood in silent respect for friends they had known for months, or sometimes just days. Offshore, on the white-hulled hospital ships that still held hundreds of wounded, services were also held for those who had died despite the best efforts of surgeons and nurses. The tolling of ships' bells carried across the water, mixing with the sound of waves lapping against the reef, creating a scene that was both solemn and achingly beautiful. But even as these memorial services were conducted, the planning staffs were already looking ahead. The next objectives had been identified: Eniwetok Atoll and the Caroline Island chain. There would be no pause, no rest for weary men who had just endured days of combat. Many of the Marines and soldiers had not yet dried the tears shed for lost brothers and friends, had not yet written the difficult letters home to parents and wives explaining how their sons and husbands had died before they were thrust into preparations for the next assault. The most severely wounded were loaded onto hospital ships and transports for evacuation to Pearl Harbor, where modern hospital facilities could provide care beyond what was possible in the forward areas. The rest of the troops immediately began the labor of transformation, turning these captured islands into American bases. They built new runways, lengthening and improving what the Japanese had started. They repaired piers and harbor facilities to accommodate larger ships. They cleared the rubble and ruins, creating open spaces for fuel dumps, ammunition storage, tent cities for garrison troops, all the infrastructure of modern war. Many of these young men, as they wielded shovels and hammers in the tropical heat, understood with growing clarity that their youth had been traded for possession of these islands, bases they would occupy for only a few months before the entire apparatus of war moved westward again. The strategic value of Kwajalein was enormous, but for the individual marine or soldier who had lost friends there, who had himself been wounded there, the compensation seemed poor. Yet they did their work without complaint for the most part, understanding that each base seized was a step closer to Japan, a step closer to ending the war and going home. With Roynamur and Kwajalein transformed into forward American bases, the pace of operations accelerated dramatically. B-25 bomber squadrons were soon staging regular strikes against Eniwetok, Truk and the Palau Islands, hitting targets that until recently had been beyond American reach. Within months, literally before the year 1944 was out, hundreds of B-24 Liberator heavy bombers were flying from these Marshall's bases to strike the Marianas, supporting the campaigns to capture Saipan, Tinian and Guam. And from the Marianas, once those islands were secured at terrible cost in the summer of 1944, the B-29 superfortress finally had the range to reach Tokyo, Kobe, Osaka, all the great cities of Japan's home islands. Like dominoes falling in sequence, each objective led to the next, each captured base enabling the next leap forward. Kwajalein thus became a vital link in this chain, opening the way toward Guam and Tinian and ultimately toward the final defeat of Japan. The atomic bombs that would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, bringing the war to its terrible conclusion, would be delivered by B-29s flying from Tinian in the Marianas. And the capture of Tinian had been made possible by control of the Marianas, which had been made possible by bases in the Marshalls, which had been secured by the capture of Kwajalein. Years after the war ended, veterans gathering for reunions would sometimes reflect on these connections, tracing the chain of causation back through the campaigns they had fought. Some would note with a mixture of pride and sadness that it all began, in many ways, on a strip of sand and coral they had once thought utterly insignificant, an atoll called Kwajalein that most Americans could not find on a map and could barely pronounce. Yet behind the strategic significance and the tactical innovations, behind the statistics of shells fired and islands captured, lay individual stories that deserved to be remembered even when they were forgotten by history. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died without proper burial, their remains scattered across the blasted landscape or buried in collapsed bunkers. Countless Korean laborers, men who had been conscripted or forced into service against their will, perished far from home in a war that was not their own. As American troops cleared the bunkers and underground shelters in the days after the battle, they found personal effects that spoke to the humanity of their enemies. Diaries filled with homesickness and longing for distant Japan, letters written but never sent, expressing apologies to families for failing to return, small photographs of wives and children, sweethearts and parents. Some Marines kept these items as souvenirs, tucking them into pockets alongside American good luck charms and family photos. Others respectfully left them where they lay, unwilling to disturb what amounted to the last possessions of dead men. A handkerchief embroidered with cherry blossoms, a package of Japanese cigarettes, an unopened letter from home that had arrived just days before the battle. These small, intimate objects served as reminders that the enemy soldiers were human beings, not the monsters that propaganda sometimes portrayed. They had families who loved them, fears and hopes and dreams that were not so different from those of the American boys who killed them. Whatever side they had fought on, whatever ideology or cause had brought them to this remote atoll in the Pacific, they were all victims of a war that had grown beyond anyone's ability to control, a conflict whose origins could be traced to decisions made by leaders who would never personally face enemy fire. The sacrifice of everyone who died at Kwajalein, Japanese and Korean and American alike, stood as a stark reminder of war's terrible cost, a cost measured not in strategic gains or tactical victories, but in individual human lives ended before their time. Kwajalein was more than a tactical triumph for American arms. It was the successful proving ground where the painful lessons learned at Tarawa were applied and validated. The coordination of amphibious tractors, Sherman tanks, and naval gunfire had been refined to a degree of precision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The technique of establishing artillery positions on small captured islets to provide direct fire support during the main assault became standard practice. Naval fire support ships learned to press close to the beaches, engaging targets with a level of accuracy that made the difference between success and catastrophe. Air power delivered sustained bombardment, not just in the hours before an assault, but for weeks beforehand, systematically destroying enemy capabilities. These tactical and operational innovations, forged in the crucible of combat and paid for in American blood, became the blueprint for every subsequent amphibious operation in the Pacific theater. The same techniques, refined and improved with each iteration, would be applied at Eniwetok, at Saipan and Guam, at Peleliu and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Each campaign would add its own lessons, its own refinements to doctrine, but the fundamental approach had been proven at Kwajalein. The individual acts of heroism, the sacrifices of men like Richard Anderson and John Power and Richard Sorensen and Colonel Samuel Diaz, became enduring symbols of the Marine Corps ethos, stories told to new generations of Marines to illustrate the standards they were expected to uphold. Their names were engraved on memorials, attached to buildings and ships, invoked in ceremonies. For the men who served with them, who witnessed their final moments, the memories remained vivid decades later. Old veterans, gathering for reunions, or speaking to historians, or simply remembering in quiet moments alone, could still see those scenes with painful clarity. They could still hear the voices of friends long dead, still smell the cordite and blood and tropical vegetation, still feel the fear and exhilaration and grief that combat brings. On that quiet night of February 4th, as the waves lapped gently against the coral shores of Kwajalein and the sounds of battle finally faded into memory, an unspoken vow echoed in the hearts of survivors. "We will keep moving forward," they promised themselves and their fallen comrades, "until this war is ended and peace returns to these distant islands." It was a promise that would require 3 more years of savage combat to fulfill. 3 years of Guam and Peleliu, of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, of kamikaze attacks and firebombing raids, before finally the atomic bombs and Japanese surrender would end the killing. But the promise was kept. The young men who survived Kwajalein did keep moving forward, island by island, battle by battle, paying the price required until victory was achieved and they could finally go home to the America they had been fighting for, an America that most of them found had changed in their absence almost as much as they themselves had changed in the fighting.